Okay, we are recording. So welcome to the virtual version of a Jane's Walk that I do have been doing for a number of years in some version or other. This is going to be a bit different, and I'm actually kind of looking forward to doing this one online, both because I'm still in my pajamas, that's kind of nice, and because we can have a chance to range a little bit wider physically across the city than you can do in a single walk. So the way I've organized this is I've just got a PowerPoint that I've screen shared with you all that's mostly Google Street View shots. And what we're going to do is just take a little bit of a Google Street View walk through some of the most important vacant spaces that I can think of in St. John's. And I'll share a little bit about each one and then open up if anyone wants to share their own thoughts or ideas about that space, so you can use the text chat, or you can unmute yourself. I'm not forcibly muting anybody because we don't have that many.
Is this already started?
We're just about to start.
You got yourself on.
No.
Hi, folks. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so you can unmute yourself to ask a question, or just pop something in the group chat. Either one works. Just before we start, there's some folks on this call that I know and some that I've never met. So my name is Josh. I've been involved in advocacy around urban issues in St. John's for a while. I was chair of the board at Happy City for quite some time, and I've been involved with a bunch of other kind of city building projects, including the St. John's Farmers Market and a number of others. So I really love walking around the city and just kind of thinking and dreaming about better ways to use the kind of spaces around us. And so I think this Jane's Walk is a little bit unusual because I'm not taking you on any kind of tour of things that exist. I'm taking you a tour of things that could be. And I think I always find it fascinating to hear from people their own ideas for these kind of spaces. So I think we'll get started. The image that's on the screen here is from, I think, last year or the year before, the physical incarnation of this walk. And I thought we'd actually start in pretty much the same place. But before we do, I want to bring up, and I know this map is difficult to read on screen, but I want to bring up a map that's really important to the conversations about physical space and change in St. John's. And some of you would have seen this, and some of you might not have. So this map here is...
Josh, we're not getting any screen, or at least I'm not. Oh. You just get a message saying you're sharing your screen, and it's black otherwise.
Oh, let me see, 1 second. Can you see, can folks see that now? There should be a slide up on the screen. Oh yeah, most folks can see. So you might want to, if you need to log back out and log back in, that might fix it.
That might be the best way. Okay.
But yeah, type in the chat box, folks, if you can't see. So right now, what's up on the screen is a map that's from the municipal plan, which is in the process of being implemented, and this is the map of intensification areas in St. John's. So this map is of the areas in the city that are being designated for intensified urban development. So the whole idea is that there are lots of reasons why we would want to build and add density in parts of the city that are already built up a little bit. It costs much less from an infrastructure perspective. It makes better use of resources. It makes our neighborhoods more livable and more pedestrian friendly. So just to give a sense of the context here, I think there's a few areas that are marked out that we're going to visit. One of them, and I think you can probably see my cursor here, one of them is the length of the Marchant Road. So pretty much all of the length of the Marchant Road is an area that's marked out for intensification. And you'll see it intersects with the area around the old Grace Hospital, also marked out for intensification. You'll see we also have Rope Walk Lane, the area there, marked out for intensification. and the area around the intersection of Freshwater Road and Merry Meeting Road and Pennywell, so where Booth used to be, Booth Memorial High School, in the center of the city, and Water Street West as well in the center of the city. And then there's a few other intensification areas marked out. The entire area around Newfoundland Drive to McDonald Drive, bordered by Torbay Road and Portugal Cove Road is marked out for intensification, as is the west end, a whole large area around Topsail, the western end of Topsail Road. And so these areas are not just theoretical. One of the things that's happened in recent years, last year in the city budget, is the city actually waived development fees in all of these intensification areas. So normally a developer who's proposing a project, they have to pay a significant amount of associated fees with that proposal, and those are waived to encourage more development in these spaces. So that's some background. I think we're going to visit some sites in a number of these areas on our little virtual walk today. And I can share this with anyone who's interested after. But the first site we're going to visit, I think we'll start this walk in the same place that we typically start it when we're on foot. And this is in the heart of one of the intensification areas marked out in the municipal plan. And this is the site of the old Grace Hospital. I think this site is very fascinating for a number of reasons, because it pulls in some of the most important dynamics in development of urban space in St. John's, which is that it's a provincially owned site, which means the city has almost no power to enforce anything happening here. So the provincial government owns it. They've demolished most of the old hospital except for the nurses' residence. And if anyone wants a good creepy scare, you can Google around for some of the videos and photos of people exploring that place. But the site itself is in a really important location in St. John's. So, you know, it's in a quite dense part of the city, in a well served by transit, in an area that's gradually changing and developing. It's also massive. And so I think one of the things to think about here is, you know, what could this site become? Because there've been conversations for many years about the future of this site, and nothing has come of it by and large. So the most sort of organized conversation I heard a number of years ago was around, at the height of the economic boom, there was some talk about moving the Supreme Court from its site on Duckworth and Water Streets to here. And that has, as far as I know, fizzled out. And it's been a long time since I've heard any kind of formal proposal here. And so we have, like with this site, it's not the only one in St. John's where the provincial government owns and controls a really important key space in our city. And it's worth folks knowing that one dynamic that always does cause tension between the province and the city here is that the province doesn't pay any property taxes on land that they own in the city. The feds do. The feds pay what they call a grant in lieu. So they pay what they should pay in property taxes, but the province doesn't. So all the provincial land in the city and structures on it, so things like the university, the hospital, none of that contributes to the municipal tax base, and that is always a bone of contention here in St. John's, as in other cities where that's the case. But so I think institutionally this site sets off some interesting dynamics, but it's also just such a critically important site that you could imagine doing so much for the community. Whether it be, in my mind, I think this is a really ideal site for some quite dense housing development, ideally with some commercial frontage on the two main streets that it fronts. And I think if anyone has spent time on this site, you also see how people use it to pass through. There's a few really important pedestrian pathways that don't feel particularly safe or pleasant to use, but we all use them, or many of us do. And so thinking about also, as this site develops, how do we make it a kind of permeable space that people can pass through on their way back and forth through the city. So that's our first stop. Anyone have any thoughts or ideas of their own about the old Grace? You can feel free to unmute yourself or pop something in the comments if you do. Otherwise, we're gonna keep walking actually down the Marchant Road. For another minute, we're gonna follow the route that we've sometimes followed in the physical version of this walk, which is we are going to walk down the Marchant Road to this spot, which I think is one of the treasures of this city that we are really missing out on right now. We're just a bit past the old Grace site here on the Marchant. We're looking at the city's best collection of Art Deco buildings from the 20s and 30s. There's a whole row of them on the right side. There's the old fire station on the left. There's a couple more actually a little bit farther up the road. There's also an undeveloped space just past that fire station on the left. And it actually, to me, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see this area turning into something that many cities have that St. John's doesn't, which is a neighborhood level downtown. So with some street fronting, say retail, you could easily see how cafes and restaurants could fit into these buildings. You could see how the streetscape could change a little bit. It's quite a wide road for what we use it for. So it's wide enough for 3 lanes. We only really use it for 2. There's a little bit of extra space here. I think this really highlights, and we'll talk about this as we go on this walk, one of the most important things that the city does have control of is how we allocate what we call the right of way, so the space between the buildings on either side of the road. So that is a precious resource. And right now on a space like this, most of it is allocated to 3 travel lanes for cars that are really only 2 travel lanes. And not a ton of it for pedestrians or for uses of for sort of outdoor seating or other amenities. But you can see where the cars are on the right there. That could all be public space. And same on the left. I had a brief moment of happiness when in the early version of the city's new bike plan, they proposed a off-street or an on-street but physically separated bike lane through this area. And it unfortunately died in the final iteration of that bike plan, because I think that would have gone a long way towards changing the landscape of Le Marchant Road. But still, there's a ton of opportunity here. One of the pieces of research we've been seeing a lot in the last few years is that we make our car lanes really far too wide. So when you narrow a lane on the road, it actually is one of the most effective things you can do for increasing road safety, because it forces drivers to pay a bit more attention. They drive a bit slower, less accidents, and the accidents that do happen are less dangerous because people are going less fast. So you could easily imagine a version of this landscape where the lanes are a little bit thinner, those sidewalks maybe get a bit wider, or we get a bike lane or a grassy space between the sidewalk and the road. Those buildings are reimagined into more public-facing businesses or residences, and suddenly we have a little downtown on our hands. And I think that's a really cool thing to think about for the future of the city. I know there are some active proposals on the go for several of these buildings. Scuttlebutt had it that some folks were considering taking over the old fire station to use as a museum of firefighting in St. John's. I'm not sure if that's gone anywhere. And there were some other sort of more storefronty ideas for it. To me, maybe this is just because I spent too much time at Bannerman Brewing. It obviously looks like a brew pub to me. But whatever it turns into, I think there are some really interesting opportunities in this end of town. Does anyone want to share anything that they think of looking at this before we move on to our next stop? All right, we're going to take a jump then to another part of the city's intensification area. Whoops, there we go. To another part of the city's intensification areas, one that we haven't visited on previous versions of this walk, but one that I also think is actually going to be a really interesting and important conversation. So we're here at the corner of Rope Walk Lane and Mundy Pond Road, and we're looking at the Muse Community Center. Not sure if there's anyone on this walk who uses that community center that regularly, but it's a really nice space. But definitely showing its age, and it's due for replacement. You'll see across the street on the left, there's a large gravel parking lot that people use for the center and to access the park at Mundy Pond. And the original proposal was to take that community center down and rebuild a new one in that gravel parking lot. But that has actually been shot down, and the new Muse Community Center is going in the far corner on the opposite end of Mundy Pond where the baseball fields are. I don't use this center all that much. It's not my neighborhood. I don't love that change because what it's done is moved it out of what is an important intensification area for the city and into what is largely a recreational and residential space. But I think the folks who live in the area and use it, that was their suggestion. And so this is an interesting kind of tension here. But what it does leave us with is a couple of really important spaces, that gravel lot, which could be something, and whatever the Muse Center becomes. Because the rest of Rope Walk Lane, we're in an interesting and kind of challenged place. It's been marked out for intensification. But over the last few years, it's actually kind of come back to life, but it's come back to life in its existing format. So we've seen the malls get revitalized with the plazas. We've seen some new drive-throughs be built in the parking lots of those plazas. And what those have done, unfortunately, is kind of closed off Rope Walk Lane to a more serious re-envisioning of what it would look like. So there's not going to be a ton of possibility in the near future of building close to the street in Rope Walk Lane, for example. But here on this Muse site and the space across the road, you could really imagine something interesting happening, whether that be, to my mind, these would be really interesting places for larger apartments, for example, maybe with some kind of street front use. Or for some kind of public-minded use, community space. And you wouldn't necessarily know it to look at them, but I think this is actually one of the more important spaces in St. John's right now. And to my knowledge, no one's made any particular proposal for either of those spots since it was decided that the new community center wouldn't go there. So that's another, I think, really one that I look at a lot as I move around this city. Anyone have any thoughts about this or things they'd like to see there? All right, I'm going to jump us along. We're not far away now. This is a bit of a weird angle. We're right next to, on Adams Avenue, right next to the old Booth High School, which has now mostly been demolished. And I think it's important to look at this space just to get a sense, A, of how large it is. So the high school on the left has been demolished and is a large piece of property. On the building on the right was the source of some pretty significant debate in this neighborhood just last year because it was bought or looking to be bought by an operator in town who operates private homeless shelters. Which is, again, I think it exposes one of the interesting dynamics of St. John's is that we don't have nearly enough capacity in our publicly run or community run shelter system. And so we have a couple of private operators who make, unfortunately, quite good money running homeless shelters for folks who are too challenging or difficult to accommodate or can't find spaces in the public system. He had proposed to buy that building on the far left, and it ran into a lot of resistance in the neighborhood. It's a really complicated conversation. But one thing that I think exposed is that this neighborhood is also a service center for vulnerable folks. There's a large Salvation Army complex there, centralizes some of their services. The other school in back behind has already been transformed now into a seniors residence. And so there's a really interesting question about what is going to happen with this large patch of land. So if you look at it from above, it's actually very significant. I would expect we'll see some residential density going in, but this area is actually not particularly well provided with retail options. And so it would be interesting to see, and I think that's something to watch about and to dream about in St. John's in the next few years is what happens to this spot, because it's a bit hard to imagine, and as you pass it by, it's hard to sort of picture how this fits into the city, but it really does. We're gonna keep walking now, virtually walking much faster than we could on foot. And the next spot, I want to take a zoom east across the city to another really important and piece of vacant land. So we've flipped over and we are now in Pleasantville. So Pleasantville is a super fascinating piece of property and opportunity for the city. We're not going to linger on this photo, which is of an empty field, because I want to show you the next screen, which is the master plan for the development of Pleasantville. So this is a number of years old now, but the way that this worked is that the lands in Pleasantville, as many of you know, they were the American military base and the Canadian Forces base for a long time. And if you look closely there, you can see that the roads are laid out in the shape of a cowboy hat. Thanks to the Americans who built the place, which is one of the reasons that Pleasantville is a bit infuriating to get around, is because there's not a straight road in the place because they had to draw a Stetson. But be that as it may, the land was transferred to a federal agency called Canada Lands early in the 2000s. And they are gradually unloading the land in Pleasantville, selling it off piece by piece to private developers to, in theory, accomplish some version of this master plan, which was developed early in the 2000s. And if you look into this plan, one of the things that's really striking is that the eventual population density projected for Pleasantville is very high by St. John's standards. This area would have a significantly higher density than downtown St. John's in people per square kilometer. But if you look at this plan and then look at what's happening in Pleasantville right now, you will see that we have some really significant divergences from the plan in lots of ways. In particular, and I think this really highlights one of the things that we need to think about when we're talking about vacant space in St. John's, is that there's very little to no commercial space in Pleasantville as there is right now. And in fact, you'll see kind of down at the bottom of the hat near the D&D facility on this map, there's a whole area marked out as mixed use commercial, and there's another one marked out for the same up to the top right. The one on the top right is what became the Housing and Homelessness Network building, and that does have one small commercial unit in it. There's a cafe there, but otherwise it's just apartments. And the one down below hasn't become anything at all. And in fact, I think that spot is the one that has now been rezoned away from mixed use commercial and rezoned to accommodate a retirement residence. And so that's not surprising. There's quite a large demand for seniors living in the city. But one of the things we see here is the same thing that I remember hearing a ton about when Happy City did some dialogue about Kenmount Terrace years ago, which is that the economic incentive is to build now what is going to sell now, which is often residential units. The commercial development piece generally doesn't become attractive until the neighborhood is built out. And so there's a real incentive for areas that are marked out as commercial in plans like this to get rezoned so that they can get built up as residential, because that gets built faster and people, there's a profit incentive, of course, there. So what we're at risk of having happen here is the exact same thing that happened in Kenmount Terrace, which is that the areas marked out for uses that would be really important for a fully functioning community are going to get eaten up by whatever can get built first. And I think that's something really to think about. I remember when we hosted some dialogue about this, and some private developers said to us, we really wish there were a stronger central plan to prevent us from doing that, because they recognize that their profit incentive was often to build single family residential as quickly as possible and sell it. But they also knew that there would be a collective benefit to the neighborhood of having some commercial space or some educational space. And so that's a real concern in Pleasantville right now, is that it's a huge neighborhood. It's not particularly well connected to the rest of the city and could really stand to have a significant amount of commercial and institutional space in it. And I'm not sure that we're going to get it. And so that's something to think about when you walk around that area. But the way that it's being handled, which is by parceling out the land to private developers, is definitely a challenge for those kind of things. And if you go on the website for this, you'll notice that this master plan is kind of on pause because the pace of development in Pleasantville has really slowed down over the last couple of years. So most of this land isn't touched yet. And so there might be an opportunity here to reimagine how this neighborhood fits into the city, because it's a huge opportunity. You'll notice over on the top left of the cowboy hat, it actually proposes a number of 10-story apartment towers, for example, which would be very significant density in the St. John's context. That's probably quite a good place to have them. But that no progress has been made yet on developing those. And so I think in the next few years, that's one of the conversations we're totally going to be having as a city is reimagining maybe how Pleasantville fits in. It will always be challenged by the fact that there's only a few ways in or out of this neighborhood. And you know, you don't pass through Pleasantville very often unless you're going to a destination in it. And with that being the case, that's always going to be a challenge for making this kind of a functional, integrated part of the city, even though its location in many ways is really spectacular. A couple minutes from downtown, overlooking the lake. It should be a really prime piece of development potential, but it sometimes gets forgotten about, and that's maybe because the federal government is taking the lead and they're not as present in the conversation.
Yeah, Josh, I'm chiming in on Osgun's phone. We're watching here together, and I'm having some audio issues on mine.
No worries.
I'll just make a quick point before my comment. I wouldn't want to go in that plan and count those trees and go there and actually count the trees. So I love that. I love that picture there. Yeah, that's one really saddens me, because I find the only thing in that whole area is that Dominion and then up on Torbay Road. And I mean, if you grew up there, you literally would never get to go to a store unless you crossed like one of these giant thoroughfares. And I find the Dominion there so unwelcoming. I just find like just the whole stairs, the whole park and entry. I guess I'd never really go there as a pedestrian. I'm a Sobeys guy, but it's real missed opportunity, because if there was anything, so many pedestrians are in that area. If there was anything on the edge facing the lake that could, you know, where you could sit down and have a coffee or a milkshake or something, because there's so many healthy focus there, that there's anything like that. I don't know. It's just, it pains me. Is there any space where anyone who's doing the pedestrian access around Kitty Vitty could see or visualize any potential open there?
Yeah, that's a good question. Hey, like, because that's not even, it's kind of at the bottom of this map. Even like the access along the boulevard isn't particularly, like, it's not a really pleasant place to be if you're walking along the road there. Hey.
No, it's not. And I run by there, and it's a tough spot. And you know, the lake, it's funny because they built that federal building, and to me it looks and feels like the new prison should look like. You know, it's got that big iron fence, and there's all these vehicles there. It's really cold. I don't know if anyone's ever been inside it. I don't know. There seems to be a lot of cars, a lot of jobs, but I don't know anyone who works there. And you know, it to me, I don't know. I think down towards the Legion area, because there's the dog park and there's that whole sports complex. There's a lot of nice area down there.
Yeah, totally. There's some space down there, and I think like the green space below the federal building there also, you know, right where it meets the road. Yeah, Pleasantville's kind of full of those big empty fields, and so like I always am kind of questioning the value of green space that's just sort of empty grassland that isn't either wild or used. You know what I mean? So like you can imagine making it a little bit nicer to be along the side of the road there, even getting towards where the Legion's to. And I think the other thing that always occurs to me is just like there's not that many ways to get in and out of the neighborhood there, right? Like there are a couple of more bridges across the stream and a couple more access ways, even on foot, like from the like Charter Avenue kind of thing down through to the Legion might help.
Yeah, I have a friend who lives in one of the older neighborhoods there, and every single time, he's lived there for about 11 years. Every time I go there, I have to use Google Maps.
Oh yeah, it's bananas. I also still get turned around in there, and like that's not an easily solvable problem with this one too, just because everything is curving and a little bit squiggly, and I think that'll be a real challenge. You're totally right.
Thanks.
All right, we're gonna jump down to the next one. We're gonna head back towards downtown now. To another site that has kind of fallen off the radar in the last couple of years, but for a little while in the boom times was getting talked about all the time, which is here, the bottom of Temperance Street there. So there's big pieces of land here that there have been proposals for over the years. We're just a little bit east of the buildings that I call, I forget what they're actually called, but I call them the salt pile condos, because you're mostly half of the year looking across at the big salt pile in the harbor. There was a proposal for a while for a second sort of extension of a similar building that I think was going to be for a little while a hotel. But as far as I know, that's largely dead in the water, where that big pit is right in front of us here. There has been some talk recently that the owner of the Four Sisters, the old stone houses there, would be turning them into some kind of hospitality-focused business. I will believe that when I see it, but it would be really lovely, of course, to see those rehabilitated. And then we have that other corner of land, which if you come next week for the walk about public libraries, a couple of the proposals were for turning that one into, a couple of people had their dream library for that spot. And that one has had a couple of very contentious proposals over the years. I got a couple of them rendered up on the screen here. If folks were following along, I think this was maybe 5 or 6 years ago now that it actually, Nolan Hall, who'd been a particularly big player for a little while in the St. John's development space, had a couple of proposals on the go and then ended up going bankrupt. And people lost their deposits. It was a whole big schmozzle. But there were a couple of proposals there, one for a kind of large condo building and then some row houses, and one just for row houses. I'm neither here nor there personally on those proposals, but I think the one on the top left of the screen there, which I think is the older one of the things it has, which I think is a really interesting thing to think about for that site, is a stairway that connects up to Battery Road. Because if anyone is like me and walks along Water Street, towards the Battery to do the North Head Trail, you know that you end up kind of looping up around the Temperance End. And so I think this is a really interesting one because this site there's some public benefit that would come from opening up ways through it. And that doesn't really often happen because we don't have a lot of tools to ask developers to do that. Here on one of the proposals, they proposed to do it anyways. But just thinking about one of the things that we miss in St. John's a lot, I think, is rights of way like this, stairways and pathways through sites. I've been watching council for a lot of years, and a number of times I've seen people buy up and close off rights of way. So sometimes you'd have a little pathway between, say, a cul-de-sac and a street next to it, and the neighbors don't like having people going by, and they've, not during this council, but certainly during previous ones, I've seen them sold off. And so it's one of the things I think that makes St. John's sometimes challenging in parts of the city to move through is we don't have a lot of these kind of interesting little connections outside of the downtown, which is honeycombed with them. So I just thought this site is an interesting one because there's a lot of argument for providing some connections up the hill. I know when they were doing the consultations around the university taking over the Battery Hotel, this was also a conversation about could they use changes to that site to allow people to pass through it more easily. And it was one of these sort of nice ideas that everyone thought was a good idea, never really happened. And so the MUN use of the Battery is you can't really shortcut up the hill through it in any meaningful way, which was something I was really hoping would happen. So I just, whenever I see a development site like this on a hill, I always think, could we mandate that there be some kind of public access through the sites? So I don't expect we'll see anything on this spot for a long time because it's probably still caught up in whatever financial kerfuffles led to these proposals dying on the vine. But it's one of those sites that just, as I walk around St. John's, it's easy to imagine this being a really actually vibrant urban part of the city rather than the kind of slight wasteland that it is right now, looking like this. Especially now that the new pier has been built down there. It's actually quite a kind of interesting space to look at. So yeah, I often think what's going to end up going here, and of course this brings up the question of how quickly any of these sites are going to get filled given the current economic context that we're heading into. Any thoughts?
Josh, there used to be a stairwell, a flight of stairs there 10 or more years ago.
Yeah, I remember that actually, because even when I first arrived in St. John's was about that time we used to cut through there. And I don't know do you know who maintained those? Were they city stairs?
I think they were. They were certainly a robust construction. It was not a cheap build. And I would think that would be aiming that as sort of a part of the tourist attraction in St. John's too. If someone gets off a cruise ship and says, I'd like to go up to Signal Hill, that would sort of expedite that kind of walk much better.
Though I would feel bad for the poor people at the Battery Cafe, because right now this all the pedestrian traffic does get channeled by their walk-by window, and that would cut them off.
Yeah, that is true.
All right, well, we'll keep going on our little walk here. It's about 11 or 10:40 now, and I want to wind this call up by around 11. But there's a couple little spots I want to visit on the way. So we'll head west now. And if we're walking west, you can't help but think, my God, what could you do with this? I remember, I don't know if anyone here went to the Harbor Ridge concerts those couple of years that this was used as an outdoor concert space, and it was actually really stunning. I remember being, so they had the stage set up kind of jammed up against the buildings in the back there. And I remember there were sailors sitting on the deck of a big ship that had pulled up to the docks just opposite this, drinking their beers and dangling the feet off of their ships and watching the concert. And I just thought it was the best thing. But this is, obviously a kind of terminally underused piece of St. John's, either as public space or as a space for building. This is another one that if you come along next week on the libraries walk, you'll see a really interesting proposal for. And of course, there was for a while quite a bit of work happening to try and figure out some interesting alternative uses for the Neil building, which is that lighthousey looking thing, and for the buildings in behind it, the two heritage buildings themselves, which has been slow and complex and likely won't go any particular place particularly quickly, but there's some really interesting opportunities. There are passageways cut through those buildings already to access this space. There was an attempt just down the way on the left side. You can't quite see it on this photo, but as folks might have been following, there was a patio installed at a restaurant, which didn't get the right permits, which is a real shame because for a little while, I think I went down there once before it got shut down. There was actually a public sitting presence here in a really kind of interesting sheltered space just tucked up against one of those buildings. So I just every time I go by here, I think how much potential there is. If we're I'm a bit of maybe a cynic on this. I don't think we're going to ever get the harbor fence knocked down, and so that might that especially means to think about how do we make Harbor Drive a more urban space, and there has to be a better use than this big enormous parking lot. One thing you can see on the right side of this image is that the Fortis building there is getting a new outside. They're putting glass down the side of it, but they're also reinvigorating some of the old event and restaurant spaces that are harbor facing there. So that might bring a little bit more public presence to that side of the road. But it's easy to imagine this space becoming a really important part of the city if they wanted it to. But it'll be a while coming, I will say.
Josh,
yeah,
there's I'm in the startup community right at Genesis with our company Tech Squad, and there's quite a buzz in that Fortis building with startups.
Cool.
Yeah, and there's talk about a steakhouse or something going on the main floor, an old style steakhouse. Anyway, I know that a few startups, I think Sequence Bio have been in there. I know DC Designs moved in there, but the owner I know, who is not without his controversy, the developers down there, but they've got like really incredibly cheap space for startups. So and it's not like, there's quite a talk about it. I could see 3 or 4 or 5 going in there after the kind of lockdown and stuff, which means that's a huge change in the type of customers that'll be around. I think they'd be open for anything, and I think you'll see that area become a lot hipper.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I agree. So the developer there has many complications, but he also, I think he has his head about some of what could happen with this space. He does seem to understand that there's a real potential for it. That's cool. I didn't know that shift had happened. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens with the space then, even in the next year or two. Just as you're right, as the users of it change, it's not just like traditional office workers who are driving in from somewhere and working in a cubicle and all that. That might push some of that change to happen.
Absolutely.
Cool. Okay, we're going to keep walking down a bit westward now. I think this spot's another interesting one. We don't have to spend too long on this one because something is going to happen here. The construction fencing is already up, and soon this will be this. And there's been a really, I think, fairly robust conversation about this project. Lots of people grumbling it's not particularly, St. John's-y looking. For what it's worth, I don't have a particular problem with it myself. It's fairly generic, but there are some really interesting elements to it. sheltered bicycle parking, a few other interior elements to allow folks to get up the hill in a barrier-free way with elevators, which I think that's one other thing that I think is interesting to flag for a lot of these sites in St. John's, is that when you build a building that negotiates two different grades like this, it can become a semi-public way of moving up the grade for folks who are using mobility devices. So people use the TD building that way because it's an elevator access from Duckworth to Water. And this would then become, for example, an elevator access from Harbor Drive up to Water Street. And so there's a really interesting conversation, I think, in buildings like this and spaces like that about how public are they and who gets access to the interior spaces to use them to move, because they're not fully public spaces. There's a private owner who might not love keeping the doors open all the time, but that does actually add an amenity for folks who might otherwise be challenged getting up and down that street. So be curious to see how that works out once this building is in place. It does seem like this one is going forward. There've been shovels in the ground on it already. And it does enclose a little bit what had been a large open surface parking lot, which is certainly nothing that anyone loves to see anywhere. If we keep moving west, this here is, I think, one of the most underused assets in the entire city of St. John's, and certainly in the entire downtown, which is George Street West. And it does not look like much when you're looking at it right now. But it really has the bones to be a semi-pedestrian, doesn't have to be closed off, but it has a real urban scale. So we've, again, maybe I'm a cynic about this, but Water Street West might be too far gone to fix. It's been designed as a highway access for industrial users, and it's huge, and no one wants to walk on it. And so when they built the Jag Hotel, I think it was very sensible of them to put the front door here on George Street West. But it's still, it's a bit of a scrabbly little street, but it's so easy to imagine this street becoming a much more kind of active use focused place with the old Relish there. Could easily, again, have some street facing patios, those kind of things. No one really needs to drive down the street to get anywhere. So even if you didn't close it entirely to pedestrians, I think it's the best candidate we have for kind of partial closure. So if anyone's been to like Argyle Street in Halifax, for example, where you might rip up the pavement, put in paving stones, and have the capability of closing it when you want to, but allow delivery vans on it sometimes. There's lots of really interesting models for doing a street like that, and some of the future development of this area is going to really lend itself to that work. One thing I think it's worth highlighting is one of the things that we really need to activate this street is a crosswalk right where we're looking right now, which is crossing Waldegrave, because it's not a particularly connected piece of infrastructure to the rest of downtown, but I really think it has a ton of potential. If we walk up George Street West, we get to what was these couple of buildings, the old seed company there, and that old tech offices, this is now a hole in the ground because it's going to be this. The expansion of the Jag Hotel, including a really large concert hall. We'll see if that project goes ahead. I know they've done the demolitions. They started their digging. Obviously, the economic situation, particularly for the hospitality and concert industry, is not very good right now. This has always struck me as a little bit of a passion project for the owner of that hotel. So it might be a bit less responsive to the economic downturn than some others. But again, this is putting one of the main entrances for this building, this new concert hall and hotel, out onto George Street West. So it's already making it a much more public focused space. And I think that's something important to note if this does go ahead. There's also the new Salvation Army Center of Hope. This building is almost done down on the corner there. And once again, it does have a significant amount of presence on the street. This is an old rendering. The newer one has actually a much nicer presence in terms of access onto George Street West. There will be a kind of a little public plaza and door there, not that sunken pit. And so again, we have some like interesting new architecture filling in the spaces. It's an interesting mix of uses, entertainment, hotels, but also services for vulnerable people. And with a little bit of creative work, this whole street could become something I think really special without a drastic change to the kind of urban engineering around it. Whereas if we keep going west, the real drastic changes, I think, are around here. So is Water Street West. There is a clutch of original heritage buildings on the right side. The left side of the road used to look the same because it used to only be 2 lanes wide, the same as the rest of Water Street. But that all the buildings on the left side, the harbor side, were demolished to widen this road. And what this has done, of course, is made it incredibly hostile space for pedestrians. It makes it really hard for businesses to hang on in those buildings there. And it's really overbuilt for the amount of traffic that it carries. In particular, I often think how much nicer it would be if you just remove that off-ramp that comes off of Pitts Memorial and funnels people at a high speed right onto Water Street. Because anyone can get onto Water Street using the other ramp that hits a set of lights. And right now what this does is cuts pedestrians off and turns this into really an urban highway in a really unpleasant way. And we're seeing cities all over the country and all over the world put roads like this on what you'd call a road diet. And you could probably get Water Street West here down to 3 lanes, 1 in each direction and a middle lane for turning traffic. And that would create an incredibly large amount of space, enough for both like some public spaces and potentially new buildings on the south side of it. So this doesn't look like vacant space, but in many ways, I think that it is.
Josh, I think that's awesome. I love that. The other thing, and you know what, your George Street West comments I thought were great. And I don't think people should discount the name value of George Street, the fact there's a new hotel and how much, like, tourists will just naturally go to that place if it gets redeveloped. But I've always envisioned the Railway Museum as an ideal, like, transit hub, bring it alive again. And then if you had this whole area, this is the problem, is the transit is that it's on that other side there. And if you could, this is a desert, you're right. Like, you get trapped. You almost get scared walking across there, even if you go back to the lights. So that's a really interesting idea. I love that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And especially the Railway Coastal Museum has some, the city I know has to rethink some of their uses because part of that building is now empty. It used to be mostly city archives and they've been moved now. So the city's going to be thinking about what to do. I don't think the museum itself is going to get the boot by any means, but there is some potential to rethink what that structure is. And I agree with you. It would be kind of cool to see something that was built as a transit terminal become one again, especially since it's right on a main road. And one thing, like, if you talk about like transit development, we're generally getting away from these kind of terminals that you have to do a lot of work to get into in malls and stuff because they slow down bus routes so much. But this one, I agree with you. That would be a really interesting spot if you re-engineered some of the roads around it. And yeah, actually just walking down Water Street, that was my other photo, and the same thing. Like, just think about how much change is going to happen here anyways. There is going to be a renovation of Victoria Park that's ongoing. There is going to be finally a crosswalk from the main gates of Victoria Park across here, because this is nightmarish for anyone who uses it. But again, this whole street, it does not need to be 5 lanes wide by any means at any time. You could easily lose 50 or 60% of the road width here and not cause a big pile of traffic problems. You probably have some backups in the highest peak points of the day, but that's, I think, one of the challenges. We build our infrastructure to handle the worst times. So it's like building parking lots to handle Black Friday, right? And then it's a huge waste of space the rest of the time. So again, there's a ton of potential for all of these, this whole space. Especially, we've seen, where it becomes a little bit more friendly to pedestrians down at the far end, at the bottom of Leslie Street. It's getting developed more. We have the new Mallard Cards thing, Water West, and there's more businesses popping up down there. And so connecting that to the rest of the city I agree with you. I think there's tons of potential there. And I think that's the end of my walk. So I want to turn it over. If anyone on the call, we have a couple of minutes left. If you have comments you'd want to raise, or if you have other spaces you dream up ideas for that haven't come up on this walk, feel free to share them.
Well, Josh, I got a comment. I feel I've been hogging the airtime, so if anyone wants to tap in, I'll jump out. But you made a comment on, about the elevation through buildings, and that came up in the parish hall development. We don't want to get into that, but the and then there's like the room, which is like a big, giant, gorgeous public space. It's like a cul-de-sac. And I was remembering that I used to work in the Bain Johnson Tower, and I used to walk through the Sheraton and or the old Hotel Newfoundland back then. And we used to stop and get coffee and stuff. And then eventually they blocked our access because they didn't like us walking through. And what I was saying is, this is something that's come up a lot lately in my mind since some of the recent discussions. And you just brought it up. It would be awesome to like see a map or have a discussion on where they are now and how we can extend them, because specifically, like you start thinking like Atlantic Place is accessible, but it's not really seen as a place people go through. There's a ton of them that are around, but we often talk about pedestrians stuff in St. John's, but we also have to accept the reality of weather. And if you cut them up and you add an opportunity to get a coffee somewhere or bounce into someone, all of a sudden that 10-minute outdoor walk becomes 6 minutes outdoors, but that's way less daunting. So I'd love to see some more discussions on that, because every time you talk about that, I really like it.
Yeah, it'd be super cool. And I know this has been a really challenging thing, certainly in the downtown, engaging some of the private landlords around this. Like even like a small example, this isn't the exact same thing, but I think it's a really similar dynamic, is all those small parking lots downtown, right? The ones that, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday are used by businesses. So like the one at Prescott and Duckworth, for example. Weekends and evenings, those things are free. They're open to everybody. The city has an online map that directs people to use them, but they could never get, I think, any permission to put physical signs up on any of them saying when they were open for public access. I'm sure that was because the owners were not enthused with that idea, because they might worry that people, leave their cars there, go out drinking and leave their cars there onto a Monday or whatever the challenge would be. But we had, I think that was that's a bit of cautionary tale, right? Because that's a pretty easy one. All you need to do is stick up a sign saying like, this lot's fair game evenings and weekends, and we couldn't quite get there. And so just thinking about how do we get landlords on board? Like, what's the incentive? I guess if you're forward looking enough, you realize it's good to have more traffic through your building. People spend money there. It creates some interesting opportunities, but I think people are pretty conservative about that, right? And worried about liability and private versus public space. But I totally agree with you. I think it'd be really cool to do a more active inventory of those rights of way, and then outside of downtown, even the rights of way between streets and the ways that people walk. Right now they're considered kind of piece by piece. Whereas if we were talking about them as a network, then I think it would be a bit more of a problem if someone said, let's close off this one. But right now, because they're just seen as an individual thing, there's a risk. And yeah, it would be really interesting. I wonder, this is not something I know a lot about. I wonder if there are other cities that have done some work on kind of building that into agreements, either with developers or with landowners about allowing access. Because I think you're right. There's some, without tunneling some underground city or building a ton of pedways or whatever, we could still do some cool stuff to make St. John's more navigable in the wintertime, especially. Yeah. Anyone else with a thought to share? All right. Well, thanks for joining on this little virtual walk. This is fun. It's always nice to think about these things. So I encourage you all to go off and do your own thinking about your own dream spaces in St. John's. And I think I'd leave you with, I would really encourage you all of you to share these ideas with your elected representatives. I think, so one of the things that's interesting about having a council now who are somewhat younger and more engaged on this stuff, there also happen to be a number of my friends on council, and I'm aware about how much council generally only hears people complaining about ideas that people have proposed. But there's a real interesting opportunity, and I think it's really welcomed. If you have an idea for an opportunity for one of these spaces, share it with your ward councillor, share it with your councillors at large, get it in there, because you never know when that'll just pop up at the right time in the right room. And so if you have them, share them and keep thinking of them. And there's lots more interesting online Jane's Walks coming up in the next little while. So keep following Happy City. I'll be back the same time next week, also on Zoom, and we're going to take a tour of the many ideas people proposed for a new public library in St. John's in a recent campaign. So it'll be another little virtual walk. So feel free to join me then, and have a good day.